Well, hey there, I'm Joshua Johnson. It's great to be with you on this Tuesday, February 22nd. Here's some of what we're talking about tonight.
This is the beginning of a Russian invasion of Ukraine.
The president is now calling Russia's military action an invasion. The administration would not say that yesterday. What changed? And who or what will determine what happens next? We've got expert analysis and a live interview from Kyiv coming up. Federal prosecutors rarely pursue hate crime charges, but they did against Ahmaud Arbery's killers and prevailed. We'll break down what happened. Then the U.S. women's soccer team plays just as hard as the men, but has earned less. That pay gap is closing after a multi-million-dollar settlement. And maybe the rent is too damn high. It's definitely higher, with rates soaring in the last year. Maybe you know that firsthand. Well, we'll dig into why this is happening and find out what you have to say. We are now seeing the beginning of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. That is how the president put it when he addressed the nation today.
This is the beginning of a Russian invasion of Ukraine. I'm going to begin to impose sanctions in response far beyond the steps we and our allies and partners implemented in 2014. Who in the Lord's name does Putin think gives him the right to declare new so-called countries on territory that belonged to his neighbors?
The president also announced sanctions against two Russian financial institutions. The idea is to cut Russia off from Western financing, and there will be penalties on Russia's sovereign debt. Mr. Biden called this the first set of heavier sanctions, with more to come. Now, the UK and other European countries already imposed their own sanctions, and Germany's chancellor announced the end of a key pipeline called Nord Stream 2. That's an $11 billion Russian-owned pipeline. You can see the diagram there. It connects Russia directly to Germany. Nord Stream 2 would deliver natural gas to Germany and other parts of the European Union. It could generate as much as $15 billion in revenue for Russia if it ever comes online. Meanwhile, Secretary of State Antony Blinken canceled his meeting with his Russian counterpart, Sergei Lavrov. He said the invasion makes the meeting moot.
Now that we see the invasion is beginning, and Russia has made clear its wholesale rejection of diplomacy, it does not make sense to go forward with that meeting at this time. I consulted with our allies and partners, all agreed. And today I sent Foreign Minister Lavrov a letter informing him of this.
Meanwhile, Russia's President Vladimir Putin has been spending a lot of time on Russian state television. First, he signed decrees declaring two regions in eastern Ukraine to be, in his words, independent republics. They are, of course, still part of Ukraine. But these regions, Donetsk and Luhansk, you see them there on the map over on the right, those regions are the areas where Russian troops have moved in. Today, Mr. Putin took it a step further. He expanded that declaration to include more of that region, including parts being held by the Ukrainian military. And that raises more fears of an armed conflict there. In a moment, we'll get a view from Ukraine, but let's start with the big picture. Joining us first is NBC News military analyst Jack Jacobs. He's a retired U.S. Army colonel and a Medal of Honor recipient. Colonel Jacobs, welcome back to the program.
Thanks, Joshua.
First of all, what do you think is the impact, is the importance of President Biden calling what Russia's doing today an invasion? What impact does using the I word have?
I don't think any impact. I'm sure Putin expected the West to respond exactly the way it did, with some measured response. They insulated themselves from a wide variety of sanctions. Calling it an invasion, whether it's an invasion or not, doesn't matter to Putin. He's going to invade no matter what. This is the beginning of a more widespread intrusion by Russia into Ukraine. They'll ask, the separatists will ask for further assistance. Don't forget also, Russia has troops in Belarus, right on the northern border of Ukraine, not far from Kyiv. At the end of the day, it's entirely possible. As a matter of fact, the West is convinced that Russia has plans, if it wants to execute them, to take total control of Ukraine. But that's going to be in steps. This is a phased operation. The initial response was exactly what Russia expected. The most serious and draconian restrictions that we could possibly impose, we have not yet done so. And we're probably going to save them for a later date. But they are the exclusion of Russia from the SWIFT system, the international payment system, which would greatly affect all of Russia. At the moment, there are a few banks, a development bank, some people who, restrictions on people who are close to Putin, but those people are more or less insulated, and there will be no major effect on either the internal banking system nor the Russian people until further sanctions are put in place. The trouble is that our Western allies, Germans in particular, are not particularly interested in imposing still further sanctions on Russia.
Right.
And Putin knows that he's playing for the long game. He can wait Ukraine out. He can wait the West out until we all get tired of talking about the fact that Russia has invaded Ukraine, and they'll go ahead and take the whole thing over when they have an opportunity to do so later on. Joshua.
Let me get your reaction to what the president and the Secretary of State said today with regard to the possibility of diplomacy going forward. Watch.
The United States and our allies and partners remain open to diplomacy if it is serious.
The United States and I personally remain committed to diplomacy if Russia is prepared to take demonstrable steps to provide the international community with any degree of confidence that it's serious about de-escalating and finding a diplomatic solution.
Colonel Jacobs, what about the possibility for diplomacy? I'm not sure exactly what that would even look like, especially since the Secretary of State told Sergei Lavrov, his Russian counterpart, that the meeting they were going to have is off based on what's happened so far. So what does diplomacy potentially even look like now?
I think there's not much potential for diplomacy at the moment, and maybe not ever. We have to remember what Russia's about here. They want to make sure that they have a buffer between them and NATO. They don't like the idea that the United States has influence in Eastern Europe. They don't like the fact that we have troops in Poland, in the Baltic states. It's really important that we stand up to Russia here because our allies in Europe will be terribly concerned if we do not, for their own safety. Diplomacy probably is not going to figure in this because at the end of the day, Russia, and particularly Putin personally, has specific objectives with respect to Europe, and they do not include giving anything away in Eastern Europe, Joshua.
Yeah. So talk to me as a military man. Set the scene for me in terms of what we can expect on the ground. We know that Russia has troops on three sides. We showed it in the map. You mentioned troops that are in Belarus. Poland is to the west, so that flank is not so much of an issue. But in terms of what happens now and how the rest of the world might respond, President Biden already said, and he reiterated it today, that this is not for the U.S. to go in and fight. The U.S.'s military commitment now is to its NATO allies. Ukraine is not part of NATO, no matter how much Vladimir Putin says it may be on the cusp of that. It's not. But from a military perspective, what are you expecting in the days and weeks to come, and what might the response to that look like?
Well, it's interesting. We've given a great deal of technological assistance, more modern weapons, and training to the Ukrainians. But at the end of the day, we have to recognize that Russia has about 200,000 of its own troops on the border with Ukraine. Plus, they have a fifth column inside the country. By the way, there are Russian nationals in other countries in Eastern Europe. And one of the reasons we're very much concerned about this is what Russia could do with their own Russian nationals in places like Poland and the Baltic countries. And that's one reason why we have to be serious about making it difficult for Russia to proceed. Nevertheless, militarily, the Ukrainians will be brave, but at the end of the day, they're not going to be able to stand up to the more modern weapons, the enormous mass of firepower the Russians have, their capability to insinuate themselves deeply into Ukraine, cut off areas of withdrawal for the Ukrainian army, it's going to be extremely difficult for Ukrainians by themselves to stand up to the Russians. And as you said, the United States, we're not sending troops into Ukraine to defend it. They're not on their own, Joshua, but it's going to be very, very tough for them if the Russians decided to push all the way through Ukraine.
And before I let you go, Colonel, I wonder what you think the prospect is. Maybe zero, but the prospect of other Western nations deciding, okay, we're going to get involved. This has gone too far. Secretary Blinken's counterpart from Ukraine today referred to the Lend-Lease program in World War II, which kind of allowed the U.S. to send weapons over to help fight Nazi Germany. We've already been sending, as you mentioned, military aid to the Ukrainians before now. Do you see a scenario in which things get so dire that Western nations decide to change course, or is this kind of baked at this point in terms of what the West is willing to do before we go?
No, I think it's the other way around. I think that Putin is, he may be crazy, but he's not stupid. He understands that there's not much stomach for getting involved in Eastern Europe by our Western allies. The Western allies have already said they don't want to get involved. We've said we're not going to get involved, and it really doesn't matter how dire it gets in Ukraine. I don't think that NATO's going to do anything more than what we have already done. Perhaps send more weapons to a rump state if it comes to that at some juncture. But at the end of the day, we're not committing forces. We've said we're not. And among the NATO allies, we're the strongest and the most likely to send troops, and we're not going to do it. Germany's not going to do it. France is not going to do it. Italy is not going to do it. And Putin knows this, which is one reason why you see is doing exactly what he's doing now, Joshua.
Retired U.S. Army Colonel Jack Jacobs, we appreciate you starting us off tonight, sir. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir.
Ukraine's foreign minister appeared alongside Secretary Blinken today, as we mentioned. He welcomed how the U.S. and Western allies are sanctioning Russia. He also made it clear that Ukraine will fight back if it comes to that.
We have two plans. Plan A is to utilize every tool of diplomacy to deter Russia and prevent further escalation. And if that fails, Plan B is to fight for every inch of our land and every city and every village.
Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky also expressed those sentiments today. He added that he will be talking to the people of Ukraine often to keep them aware of how their government will handle this crisis. But how is that message being received by the Ukrainian people? Let's continue now from Kyiv with Terrell Jermaine Starr. He's a senior non-resident fellow at the Atlantic Council's Eurasia Center, and he hosts the podcast Black Diplomats. Mr. Starr, welcome back to the program. Good to see you again.
Thank you for having me.
What's the mood like in Kyiv today, particularly after the latest developments with Russia and after President Biden and President Zelensky's remarks?
The attitude here in Kiev is calm, resolute. As I told you before, I'm in downtown, and everything is going about as it usually would. The gas line, there are no long gas lines, and the supermarkets are fully stocked with food. And if there's a restaurant that's open late at night, people are there. Any activities that went on prior to this escalation is still taking place, and people are resolute. And in fact, they are preparing for the worst. Ukrainians know that the West is not going to send any military support. In fact, on Saturday, I will be going to a military drill in which Ukrainians are training themselves to prepare for the worst, to provide themselves military aid. Medical aid in the event that this city is bombed, in the event that you have flows of people coming from the east who need support. And so right now it's pretty calm, and there's no fear. You have to remember in 2014, the people sacrificed their lives and defended their own country by giving their blood. More than 100 people were killed by state security forces, and a Russian invasion is not going to shake the will of the Ukrainian people. That's something that was made very clear to me during the past 2 months I've been here.
What would you say people think of Volodymyr Zelensky, the president, right now, in terms of how he's doing?
Well, it's an interesting question. You have a lot of mixed feelings about Zelensky right now, but generally speaking, people are very happy with his language. And I know that people in the West often refer to him as a comedian, which in my mind is kind of offensive, and it ghettoizes him because, yeah, we know that. But, here people are happy, particularly with his speech at Munich. And he's essentially a wartime president right now. And people are happy with his language. They're happy with his resolve to push for sanctions. He's doing the best that he can do in this situation, because what the biggest responsibility that he has right now is that he has to maintain investor confidence in this region, because beyond the troop movement here, one of the things that Putin is trying to do is to shake the confidence by the West into Ukraine. He wants it to be Ukraine to be so polarizing and so unattractive that people will no longer have interest in it, and that therefore will discourage the Ukrainian people from pursuing a Western route. That's not going to happen, but that is what he's trying to do. And Zelensky is trying to provide a moral confidence in his people, and you have a lot of folks here who are approving of that.
Could you dig into the comments that Putin has made in the last few days about Donetsk and Luhansk, the two regions in eastern Ukraine that he kind of unilaterally declared to be independent republics, and then expanded the region that he said he was referring to? Like, what's the impact of that in a real world sense? Do Ukrainians resonate with that? Do they care about that? Is that something more that we're noticing than they're noticing? Like, how do you see the impact of that?
Well, let's talk about the impact directly. So you have Luhansk and Donbass. Donbass, a lot of people do not know that much of the Donbass region is under Ukrainian control. And so this declaration by Putin to send troops to those regions means that those troops are going to push and take all of Donbass. They have the military power to do so. And I have friends and colleagues who have family in those regions, and they fear that their loved ones will have to interface with Russian troops. And then there are some people who refuse to leave. They refuse to be internally displaced people. They refuse to be refugees that are pushed pushed out of their country. And so there is widespread fear in that regard. And more specifically with Putin, he has never recognized Ukraine as a sovereign nation. He has never recognized the agency of the Ukrainian people. Like I said, he treats the Ukrainian people like they're subhuman beings, like they're beneath the Russian people. And so there is a very racist Eastern European racism that's taking place with Putin's discussion of the with the Ukrainian people. And so he has a very Catherine the Great mindset. I mean, we talk about him wanting to resurrect the Soviet Union, and I did to a certain extent, but we have to look at Catherine the Great. This country was taken over in large part during Catherine the Great's rule during the late 1780s. And the way that he speaks in his very revisionist framework, right? I call it Putin's critical Ukraine theory. He manufactures lies about this region to justify unnecessary actions, punitive actions. And so he sees this as a place, an oblast of Russia. He says that Ukraine essentially are little brothers. They're one, but he really treats them very much like subjects and slaves, so to speak. And so the resonance that is taking place here in Ukraine is that of a dictator that treats them as subhuman, and it's something that pretty much resonates with Ukrainians here in that way.
Before I have to let you go, what about the sanctions that were announced by the U.S. and other Western countries today, and whatever sanctions may come going forward? How do the Ukrainian people feel about that particular aspect of the West's response to all this, before we go?
Yeah, so Germany announced that they are going to halt the certification process of the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. That's promising news to people here. But I'll say that we don't know what Biden and the West's red line is. And so they talk about invasion. That's a very blurred word right now, because it's important to note that this country has been invaded for the past 8 years. So an invasion has taken place, and people feel that sanctions should have been levied a long time ago. Now, when you talk about sanctions, does Biden mean specifically troops going beyond the Donbass and Luhansk regions, is that considered the West definition of invasion? If Russian troops come from the north and surround Kiev, where I'm located, is that the definition of invasion? And so people are confused on that use of the term. I would like to know what the West means by that. Ukrainians like to know what that means. We don't necessarily know, but people definitely are somewhat optimistic that the sanctions regime will be ratcheted up. But definitely people are asking for more robust sanctions given Russia's activity.
That's interesting that you bring that up. If we have the chance to speak again, I might want to dig more into this idea of a red line, as you put it, in terms of how what the West is doing telegraphs to the Ukrainian people and how that kind of relationship feels. For now, please do stay safe, sir. Terrell Jermaine Starr joining us from Kyiv. Thank you very much. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
Still to come, the 3 men convicted for Ahmaud Arbery's murder were found guilty today on hate crime charges. We'll break down how the prosecution prevailed and what that tells us about the law today. We're glad you're with us for Now Tonight from NBC News. It has been almost 10 years since the death of Trayvon Martin. And today, a federal jury did something that might have seemed like a long shot back then. The jury found the 3 white men who killed Ahmaud Arbery, who was black, guilty on hate crime charges. Gregory and Travis McMichael, their father and son, and their neighbor, William Bryan, were convicted on various charges. Those included attempted kidnapping and the use of a firearm to commit a crime. Tomorrow will mark 2 years since Ahmaud Arbery's death. His mother spoke shortly after the verdict.
I, as a mom, we will never heal. We as a family will never get victory because Ahmaud is gone forever. Come on.
And Attorney General Merrick Garland said this about the trial's outcome.
Wanda Jones, who you mentioned, said at a press conference after this verdict that was in that essentially justice was served because the family pushed in court to have a judge reject this plea deal. That's the only reason justice was served. What's your response to that?
I cannot imagine the pain that a mother feels to have her son run down and then gunned down while taking a jog on a public street. My heart goes out to her and to the family. That's really all I can say about this.
Joining us now is Georgetown law professor Paul Butler. He's a former federal prosecutor and the author of Chokehold, Policing Black Men. Professor Butler, welcome. Good to see you again.
It's great to be here, Joshua.
What do you think made the difference with this verdict?
So this prosecution was in part symbolic because the 3 defendants had already been sentenced to life in prison in the state murder case. The federal convictions serve as insurance in the unlikely event that the state convictions are overturned. And the federal convictions also represent an official recognition that Mr. Arbery was killed because he was black. And Joshua, that's what made the difference to Mr. Arbery's family. Race did not come up in this state trial because the prosecutors didn't have to prove racial animus in order to win their murder conviction. But Mr. Arbery's family said it was important that the evil of racism be named and legally recognized. And that's what the jury did today. It found that all 3 defendants willfully violated Mr. Arbery's right to be on a public street, and they did so based on anti-black prejudice.
Talk about the evidence that the prosecution used to make that case. The other night we were talking about how rare it is for the Department of Justice to even pursue cases like this. I mean, Justice Department data shows that from 2005 to 2019, it only pursued about 17% of these kinds of cases for prosecution, and most were let go because of a lack of evidence. What kind of evidence does one use in a federal hate crime trial that could secure a conviction like this?
So this case had unusually good evidence. There was smoking gun evidence of the defendant's racism and social media postings and witness testimony. And there was the crucial videotape evidence of the last moments of Mr. Arbery's life. And that quality of evidence just doesn't exist in most cases. The jury heard the N-word a lot in this trial in quotes from the defendants. The jury heard that Mr. Bryant, one of the defendants, was angry that his daughter was dating an African-American man. And the jury heard Travis McMichael talk about what he wanted to do, the violent things he wanted to do to Black people who he perceived as criminals. So it's called a hate crime, but the jurors didn't have to find that the three defendants hated Mr. Arbery, but only that they were motivated to hunt him down and kill him in significant part because he was Black.
How did the defense push back against that evidence? What was their case like?
So the defense said, yes, we said racist stuff in the past, but we killed Mr. Arbery in self-defense, not because he was Black. So in some ways, the defense at the federal trial was like the defense at the state trial, and it was just as unsuccessful. So now in Georgia, the defendants are convicted murderers, and in the federal criminal legal process, they are guilty of hate crimes.
You said that this case was kind of, I believe the word you used was insurance in the event that the state trial, that their conviction is overturned for any reason. What kind of penalties are we talking about here? I mean, is there additional sentencing that comes along with this federal conviction, or how does that work?
There is additional sentencing, but it's kind of a moot point. The father and son, Gregory and Travis McMichael, will die in prison. They were sentenced for the state murder charge to life without the possibility of parole. Mr. Bryan, who's in his early 50s, has life with the possibility of parole, but he has to serve 30 years first. And that's why I meant that the sentence is symbolic in a way. Again, what it recognizes is the role of anti-Black bias in this crime.
I do want to get to one more cut of Ahmaud Arbery's mother talking about what her family's been through up to this point. Watch.
What we got today, we wouldn't have gotten today if it wasn't for the fight that the family put up on January the 31st. We got a victory today. But it's so many families out there who don't get victories because of people that we have fighting for us.
Before I let you go, Professor Butler, we mentioned that the 10-year mark after the death of Trayvon Martin is coming up this Saturday. And I think that a verdict like this, a conviction like this, would have felt kind of impossible at the time. What do you make of what this says based on all that has happened in those intervening 10 years? So
the fact that a majority white rural Georgia jury convicted 3 white men of killing an African-American man motivated by hate means that prosecutors now might be more willing to bring charges in these kinds of cases, even than they were 5 years ago. There was one Black man on the jury, and in one sign of progress, the jurors made him the foreperson. And finally, Josh, what's also important to recognize that Mr. Arbery's death has inspired significant change. The state revised its law on citizens' arrest. The former law dated back to the Civil War and was designed to help catch runaway slaves. And before this case, Georgia never had a state hate crime law, but now it does. Criminal prosecutions are about bringing individuals to justice, and that has now happened in both the federal and state court. But the tragedy of Mr. Arbery's death may have put in place reforms that hopefully will help prevent future tragedies.
Georgetown Law Professor Paul Butler. Professor, it's always good to see you, sir. Thank you very much.
Great to be here.
The history of blacks in America is something I recently discussed with LeVar Burton. It is the 45th anniversary of his very first role on television as Kunta Kinte in the groundbreaking miniseries Roots. Mr. Burton was understandably angry over how slavery has been whitewashed, including in some history books.
So much so as to go so far in saying that there were slaves who were completely comfortable with their condition of enslavement, and that there were many, many plantation owners and slave masters who were very benevolent. Chattel slavery in America was the most cruel institution ever visited in the modern era.
You'll see my conversation with LeVar Burton during our special program, Black History Now. Plus, we'll learn what critical race theory really is from someone who literally wrote a book on it. Set your DVR right now or make yourself a reminder for Black History Now this Thursday night at 8 Eastern at this time here on NBC News Now. Coming up, how do we balance LGBTQ rights against the First Amendment? We'll tell you about a case the Supreme Court just agreed to hear. Plus, Hong Kong says it will test its entire population for COVID. 7.5 million people. Your headlines are just ahead. Stay close. So in this country, the law is meant to balance our rights against each other. No right is absolute. But how should we balance the rights of LGBTQ people against our First Amendment rights? That is the focus of a case now headed to the Supreme Court. The case involves a web designer in Colorado. She says she wants to offer her services for heterosexual weddings only because of her religious beliefs. And freedom of religion is the first freedom mentioned in the First Amendment. Now, the Supreme Court has touched this issue before, back in 2019. You might remember a baker, also in Colorado, who opposed making a wedding cake for a gay couple. The court narrowly sided with the baker. However, it punted on the bigger constitutional question. MSNBC legal analyst Melissa Murray says this case could have much more impact.
This is not just a case that will focus exclusively on the civil rights of gay men and women. It will have repercussions for other civil rights laws. So if the court determines that because of religious principles or because of free speech principles that this individual cannot and is not required to serve LGBTQ persons, that would have repercussions for other kinds of civil rights protections as well.
Now, the court will hear this case in the fall term starting in October. And unlike that case from 2018, it has 2 additional justices appointed by President Trump now, Amy Coney Barrett and Brett Kavanaugh. You shared some very strong opinions on this case with us. Raymond tweeted, "How can it be that it's even a question in a decent democratic country?" Linda tweeted, "No, SCOTUS, the Supreme Court of the United States, shouldn't even hear this case. You don't get to discriminate." And Carol tweeted, "Everyone should be served. This is disgusting." Meanwhile, Colombia just made a landmark ruling regarding abortion rights. Its constitutional court ruled in favor of legalizing abortion up to 24 weeks of pregnancy. Previously, abortion in Colombia was legal only under 3 circumstances: rape or incest, a danger to the mother's life, or if the fetus would not survive. Colombia's ruling is part of a growing trend in the region. Mexico's Supreme Court decriminalized abortion back in September. Argentina did the same at the end of 2020. In the Colombian capital of Bogotá, abortion rights activists celebrated in the streets, but they and abortion rights opponents both acknowledged this ruling was mixed.
Total es el objetivo, pero estamos celebrando hoy porque se avanzó un poco.
Pues es un empate porque vamos a luchar para que esta sentencia de la Corte se caiga. No hay ley, no está legalizado, está despenalizado. Sigue siendo un crimen.
And finally, if you live in Hong Kong, you're about to get tested for COVID, like it or not. Today, that city's leader announced that all 7.5 million people there will be tested next month 3 times each. She added that testing capacity will increase to handle at least 1 million tests a day. Hong Kong is struggling to contain a surge of the Omicron variant. In the past week alone, the city reported about 5,000 daily infections, and that increase threatens to overwhelm its healthcare system. Coming up, the U.S. women's national soccer team is victorious, this time off the field. What their multi-million-dollar win could mean for female athletes when we come back.
For us, this is just a huge win in ensuring that we not only right the wrongs of the past, but set the next generation up for something that we could only have dreamed of.
Women in America are still making less than men for equal work, sometimes even when they outperform the men. Like the U.S. women's national soccer team. Its players just reached a $24 million settlement with the U.S. Soccer Federation. They sued for gender discrimination back in 2019, claiming unequal pay. About 28 members of the women's team will get nearly all the settlement, about $22 million, as back pay. The last $2 million will go into a fund to support their post-career goals or charitable efforts. In the settlement, the Federation agreed to pay the men and the women equal rates for friendlies and for tournaments. The differences in pay are pretty significant, and there are differences in their contracts. One of the biggest disparities is in the bonuses offered during the World Cup. According to ESPN, qualifying for the World Cup earns the men's team $2.5 million. Qualifying gets the women's team $750,000. The teams also get bonuses based on how well they do. If the U.S. men were to win the World Cup, they would earn more than $9 million. If the U.S. women win, they get $2.5 million. Actually, I'm sorry, that's not quite right. The men have not gotten that much money for winning the World Cup because they've never won. The men have never even made the finals. The women have won 4 times. The players in U.S. soccer released a joint statement recognizing the settlement and the impact that it will have for the women now and in the future. Joining us tonight to discuss this is Emily Karen. She covers the business of sports for Sportico with a focus on collegiate and women's sports. Ms. Karen, welcome. Good to have you with us.
Thanks for having me.
What do you make of this settlement?
You know, it's a great question. I think this settlement is a huge step forward. It is obviously not to the tune that the players were hoping when they initially filed this lawsuit, and they were seeking almost $67 million in back pay. But what it does, like you mentioned, you're talking about, it sets up a better future for female soccer players in the U.S. in, equalizing future payments and kind of opening a door for potentially millions of additional dollars to be funneled to those players and the next generation of women's national team players in the future.
So they had been seeking, I'm sorry, you broke up on me a little bit. It sounded like you said they had been seeking $67 million, and this settlement is for $24 million. Did I hear that right?
That is correct.
I wonder why, perhaps, and maybe you don't know this, but I wonder why they decided to settle rather than taking this all the way. I mean, the success of the women's national soccer team compared to the men's national soccer team is such an old rolling joke, it's not even funny. Like, there is obviously a disparity in what they're getting based on just their sheer ability to win.
There definitely is. And I think part of this is a legal battle that has gone on for 6 years now. The actual lawsuit was filed in 2019, but the first discrimination complaint was filed 3 years prior to that. It has been a very long process for everyone involved. And at this point, it was going to go to a court of appeals next month. And I think the Women's Team Players Association and their legal counsel and their representatives decided, this is probably the best solution for everybody right now. And it secures, like we talked about, a better future. And that was really the end goal in all of this, more so than even the back pay payments that they wanted.
Talk about the business behind women's soccer compared to men's soccer. There are so many of the women's players who have become these huge stars, Megan Rapinoe and Abby Wambach and others who are have these huge followings around them. What about the dollars and cents behind just the revenue that the men's team brings in versus the women's team?
It's hard to fully, get into all of that because all of the money from sponsorships and other partners goes kind of into one large U.S. soccer pool. And it's not specifically allocated to one team or another, which was one of the issues that, came up during this lawsuit and this legal battle. But in terms of what they're making for match money and gameplay, the men's and women's teams have been relatively equal over the years. There's also an argument that's been made as of late that a lot of the sponsorship money, which is a huge section, I think it's more than 60% of U.S. soccer's annual revenue, most of that money in recent years has been coming from brands who want to partner with U.S. soccer to support the women's team in particular and their efforts to kind of grow the game for women more broadly. So there's a large chunk of that that's coming from the women's team, and that, you know, it's undeniably associated with their success on the field.
So in a way, if I'm hearing you right, even just being able to be specific about the financial value of the women's team versus the men's team is a little opaque because it's all dumped in the same pot, and that makes it kind of difficult to suss out the raw dollars and cents behind it.
Exactly.
We heard today from Megan Rapinoe, Alex Morgan, and also Cindy Parlow-Cohn, who is the president of the U.S. Soccer Federation. They were on Today this morning. Here's part of what they said. Watch.
Obviously, we call on FIFA to truly equalize that for men's and women's tournaments, but we are looking to work with the Men's Players Association and U.S. Soccer to have that equal moving forward. So it's really what we set out to do, equalize on all fronts.
How much of this has to do with larger international soccer leagues like FIFA as opposed to what has to be done stateside?
It's a great question, Joshua, and that is actually a huge problem that has come to light in all of this, and it's something that U.S. Soccer now has to work to address in the collective bargaining agreements it's trying to negotiate with the men's and women's teams moving forward, because a lot of federation money comes from FIFA, and it comes from the tournament revenue there. And if you look at the most recent case study we have for this, which is the 2018 men's FIFA tournament and 2019 women's, the women's tournament payout, the total prize pool was $30 million. The total prize pool for the men's tournament was $400 million. Now, that didn't end up making much of a difference because the U.S. men's team didn't qualify that year. But the scale of the payouts and the discrepancies there, you know, the women's team winner is making $4 million. So that's how much U.S. Soccer got in 2019, and that was actually double what the payout was from 2015, as opposed to, you know, the men, whoever wins the FIFA men's tournament is taking home $38 million, which is more than the total pool of all prize money for women's team participants was in 2019. And once that money is then allocated to the federations based on how far they made it, that's how they then go ahead and decide how much each player gets based on the different contracts that each specific federation has with their athletes.
Before I have to let you go, very briefly, the WNBA Players Union put out a statement today in support of the settlement with the U.S. women's national soccer team. Before I let you go, briefly, what do you see in terms of the gender pay gap and the equity gap in other women's sports? Soccer feels like it's slightly different just because the men and the women kind of play in a different way as opposed to like the WNBA and the NBA. Those have a slightly different relationship.
That's exactly the right way to think about it, because U.S. Soccer is paying men's and women's team from sort of one giant pool of U.S. Soccer funds, whereas the NBA and the WNBA are separate entities, even if they're, you know, financially tied by some of the support that the NBA gives the WNBA. But what all of these leagues, and we're seeing this across women's sports, there is a fight for livable wages for their athletes and for increased pay and for, you know, the organizations that they're part of to recognize the value that they have and really try to monetize that in a way that hasn't necessarily been done before.
I realize I just did something sexist and stupid. I said WNBA and NBA. I think even in my head, there is a mental hierarchy between the value of the men's sport and the women's sport instead of seeing the value of both. I feel like I'm starting to realize why it's so hard to make this cultural shift. That was me being sexist and stupid, but I appreciate you making time to break this down for us. I am learning on the job. For goodness sake. Emily, Karen, I appreciate you talking to me tonight. Thank you very much.
Thanks for having me.
Fill in the blank. The rent is... Your answer makes even more sense these days. Rents are rising dramatically in markets that were already hot. We'll get into what's behind this before we go. It's a real good time to be in the real estate business. Prices are soaring. Home buyers are offering tens of thousands of dollars over asking prices, and more renters are being priced out of town. Check out Realtor.com's report on last month's real estate costs. Studio apartment rents rose about 21% year over year. 21%. 1 and 2 bedrooms each rose about 19%. And where is the rent rising the most? The Sun Belt. The top 4 metro areas are all in Florida. The 5th, San Diego, California. Joining us now is Liam Dillon. He covers housing affordability for the Los Angeles Times. Mr. Dillon, welcome to the program.
Thank you so much for having me.
I used to live in California. I lived in the San Francisco Bay Area, where it seems like it's always expensive and getting more so. So I understand what's happening there. Talk to us about what's happening in Southern California. What is it about the region that's making the rents and the cost of living rise so fast?
So I think it's a combination of a lot of things, but I think at base, it's simply a matter of there not being enough homes available for everybody who wants to live in Southern California. I mean, it's been for decades, we've seen not significant increases in home construction while, the economy has been great in the Bay Area. The economy has been very good in Southern California. And so you see this sort of clash of supply and demand really meeting with the rubber meeting the road. At the same time, you've seen this, large increase in millennial population, which is entering sort of prime, sort of family formation years, looking for bigger homes. And so all this is happening again, and also in the middle of a pandemic, and all these forces are coming together to make it very, very difficult for people to afford to live here.
Home construction is also highly, highly political in California, right? I imagine that there are a lot of parts of Southern California where longtime residents who drove out to California in the 40s and the 50s and the 60s and the 70s expecting to, have their plot of land and, live their California dream, don't feel like losing their view of the coastline. They paid for it decades ago, and they're going to keep it.
Absolutely. I mean, there's a lot of situations where, you have this sort of not in my backyard mentality, right? Where folks, use laws that exist in California and have been put into place, predominantly since the 70s that make it much, much harder to build here. The state is trying to do some things in that regard by allowing for, say, duplex construction, fourplex construction in neighborhoods that were previously only reserved for single-family homes. But again, the supply and demand imbalance is really what's driving a lot of this, and I think particularly so when it comes to the construction of low-income housing. I mean, those shortages of available homes for the poorest residents in the state and homeless residents in the state are even lower, right? And there's a significant shortage in funding to help support the construction of those new homes. And so really all around, shortage of available homes for everybody, shortage of money to support the construction of low-income homes, and you sort of see the result is what you have here.
What about the people, who are in Southern California who are trying to find a way to just live? I mean, I remember seeing all of these polls and graphs during the pandemic saying, oh, people are fleeing the San Francisco Bay Area. Texas's Governor Greg Abbott made a big deal of how people were leaving California for Texas. If you dig into the post office data where people moved to, most of the people who moved were moving out of San Francisco to like Oakland. They weren't fleeing the region, and then they moved elsewhere in California, then they left the state. But I'm guessing those are people who have the economic means to move at all. What about the people who don't? What becomes of them?
Yeah, I think what you're really seeing in the migration data that you referenced is, this sort of, if you're affluent enough, you can find a way, right? And you can find a way to live. And even if you're, middle class, upper middle class, you're paying more on rent. And maybe you can't afford to buy a house, but you can afford to live in California. At the lowest end of the economic spectrum, of course, this is why you've seen the explosion in homelessness. This huge number, largest population of unsheltered residents in the country is in California. That number's only been growing, and we expect it to grow, during the pandemic. What you're really seeing the outflow, though, is those who are, lower working class, lower middle class, who just the rents are going up so much where they really, have to be able to find sort of more house somewhere else. And I think a really good example of that is the city of Fresno in the Central Valley, one of the poorest places in the state. And yet, from 2017 forward, even when urban rents were decreasing during the pandemic in San Francisco and in LA, they were continuing to go up in Fresno, up 39%. Average rents in Fresno between 2017 and 2021, and just to a point where folks there really could no longer afford to live in the state at all.
Briefly, we heard from a few of you about how you're dealing with rent. Welshman tweeted, "Thank God we decided to buy a condo when we returned to San Diego after being stationed in Singapore for 3 years in 2014. No way we could afford rent in our neighborhood, which is more than our mortgage." before I got to let you go, how much political will is there to do something about all this? I know Los Angeles is getting ready to have a mayoral election. Is this an issue that's coming up in local politics before we go?
Oh, absolutely. And I think most, particularly in LA, it's the homelessness issue. I mean, really, literally everywhere you go, you see evidence of unsheltered homelessness everywhere. And it's the prominent top of the line, not even a close second. Is there any other issue other than homelessness in LA? And of course, housing affordability is very much tied into that. I think many experts agree the primary reason for increase in homelessness is because the rents are, soaring, right? And if you can't afford your apartment, then you're often not very close or not very far away, rather, from living on the street. And that's what you're seeing in LA. And so, I think there's been a lot of political attention to this. The governor 2 years ago, even before the pandemic, Gavin Newsom, dedicated his entire State of the State speech to homelessness issues. And, a lot of new money is flowing in. There are a lot of new ideas, but at the same time, nothing that we're really seeing that sort of gets at the heart of the matter, which is we need to see a significant increase in home construction and a significant increase in construction and money towards low-income housing development.
Liam Dillon of the Los Angeles Times, thanks very much. We appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
Now, if all this resonates with you, please do send us your stories about paying the rent today. How's it changing these days? Are you able to stay in your home, or are you making some changes? Tell us your story. We're at NBC Now Tonight on Twitter, TikTok, Facebook, and Instagram. You can reach out to us directly by voicemail, 888-575-2NBC. That's 888-575-2622. Or email us nowtonight@nbcnews.com. Looking forward to hearing your stories, but until we meet again, I'm Joshua Johnson. Thank you for making time for us, and we'll see you tomorrow. Good night.
Thanks for watching our YouTube channel. Follow today's top stories and breaking news by downloading the NBC News app.